Welcome to the Evolution 2.0 podcast, where we explore the intersection of art, technology, business, biology, and spirituality. Here you'll discover new trends in evolution that are changing the way we think about everything. This is your host, Perry Marshall, author of Evolution 2.0, 80/20 Sales and Marketing, and Guides to Ethernet, Google, and Facebook. I'm founder of the Evolution 2.0 Prize, a quest for the missing link between earth science, the information age, and life itself. Let's join the conversation now. So, this is Perry Marshall, and I have a very interesting gentleman to interview today. This is Stuart Kauffman. And Stu is a notorious scientist who just turned 80, and he's been...
I've got 3 weeks to go.
Okay. Well, because I went to his 80th birthday party, which we'll get to that. But he's been connected with the Santa Fe Institute, and the Santa Fe Institute is in New Mexico and is very, very interested in many kinds of self-organization and patterns in nature that maybe other scientists and other institutions don't pay quite enough attention to. And Addie Pross is a mutual friend, and Addie got me, he's a chemist in Israel, and Addie got me invited to this crazy event. And I went there, and what it was maybe 75 scientists.
43. Well,
okay.
We're 43.
Well, but there was some more people than 43. Okay. I know that.
Yeah, there were.
But a bunch of like machine gun fire, like presentation after presentation. There was 40 presentations in 2 days. It was an immense amount of information, but everybody, what they were presenting was in some way connected to things that Stu has investigated over the last, 60 years of his career. And I had never seen this. I've seen this in other fields, but I'd never seen a scientist who I would describe as an alchemist who has spent his career spinning out ideas, and they could actually get other scientists to go work on these ideas and get inspired by it. And it was incredibly interdisciplinary. There were physicists, chemists, biologists, engineers, CEOs, venture capitalists. There was a couple of philosophers, and all these different fields. And it was wonderful. And in 3 days, I never had a dull conversation with anybody. I could just walk around and sit down. So what do you do? And I would have an interesting conversation. And during one of the talks, I passed Stu a note. And the note said, Stu, you are an interdisciplinary guy, and the world does not just throw open its arms and welcome interdisciplinary people to just hop around from field to field. Usually different fields resist outsiders. And so it's difficult socially, it's difficult economically, but you managed to do this. I want to know how. Can I interview you? And that is why we were having this conversation. And so, Stu, thank you for agreeing to have this interview.
Let's do it.
So it was really amazing to see that. And boy, if you're gonna have an 80th birthday party, I guess having a bunch of people from all over the world come in and give presentations based on your work, that's pretty good. So you're a medical doctor.
Yep.
At the beginning. Can you give me just a little biography? And you can tell me about your mom and dad, or like whatever you think is relevant, but give us a little bit of sense of like who you are, and then we'll eventually start unpacking this interdisciplinary thing. Who is this guy, and where did he come from?
So I was born in 1939, just as World War II started, in Sacramento. I'm trying to get the light so that it works, but of course it doesn't. In Sacramento, Jewish. A big thing in my life was that the Holocaust became known by the time I was around 5. And Perry, I remember jumping off the low wall in the front of our house at age 5 or 6 with a baseball bat over my head, swinging it down as I jumped, imagining I was crushing Nazi skulls. So it was deep in me, and the Holocaust is still deep in me. I've gotten over being angry at Germany and have a number of really fine German friends, so that's passed, but it was huge in my life. I had an ordinary education in grammar school and junior high school. Took Latin in junior high school, where the teacher said the best way to learn French is to learn Latin. And I reasoned that it was easier to learn French by learning French than learning Latin. So I didn't take any languages in high school, but I learned about 4 or 5 languages by the time I was 25. What really happened in my life that changed me, as I was a junior in high school, and I had this amazing English teacher, Fred Todd. He was antique. He was 24. Fred was the cousin of Donald O'Connor, just an amazing guy. And we wrote a musical together. And the best parts of it, Fred wrote. But anyway, I wanted to be a playwright when I went off I went to Dartmouth, and I wanted to be a playwright. You know, if Eugene O'Neill can do it and Shakespeare can do it, what the heck? So I wrote 2 really bad plays with my roommates, which were terrible knockoffs of Eugene O'Neill. Wrote bad takes of Dylan Thomas poetry, and found that I was philosophizing too much. And so I decided to go into philosophy. So I majored in philosophy and psychology at Dartmouth, essentially got straight A's at Dartmouth. I graduated 3rd in my class. I think that I thought that I was pretty smart. I don't think I'm spectacularly smart, Perry, but I am in fact unusually creative. So it's both funny, fun, and interesting that the best I ever did on a test, that I don't think I've ever told anybody this, I've told a few people in public, is when I was 21, I took a Rorschach test. And the best I ever did in my life was on a Rorschach test. So what does it mean to do well on a Rorschach test? Well, you know what a Rorschach test is. I was just having fun. So I was just looking at the cards. And what I did is, it turns out, is I looked at the whole of each card and rotated the card. And I took several looks at the whole thing, and at subparts in all sorts of ways, and at subparts, and then subparts. Then I came back out and looked at the whole thing again. Just to see what I could see in it and have a good time. Well, the people there were actually pretty excited. They said it was the most creative Rorschach they'd seen in 20 years. That's interesting. So I guess I got an A+ on a Rorschach. So I do think that has something to do, or that way that my head works, has something to do with me being, the kind of scientist that I am. So there's another issue to get laid out. John Stuart Mill wrote about science, and he said there's induction and deduction. And that's after Hume came along and criticized induction, that nothing justifies it except induction itself. And that's been a long debate in the philosophy of science. Then I guess it is C.S. Peirce who comes along and say, in addition to deduction, you deduce the consequences of your premise, and induction, where the simple cases, I've looked at 10,000 swans and they're all white, and I say all swans are white, which has the problem you can never prove it, but as Popper said, you can disprove it if you see one black swan. So science consists in trying to disprove your hypotheses. Well, Popper was never a scientist. Most of us work diligently to try to prove our hypotheses and ignore our colleagues. It's hard to prove or disprove anything. Then Popper comes up, not Popper, C.S. Peirce comes along. He defines abduction, which is basically finding the case under which this fits. It's like differential diagnosis. And that's fundamentally something like having a hypothesis and seeing if the hypothesis could fit the facts. So there's a bunch of things here to say that I think are interesting. But anyway, nobody touches on something that I think is equally or even more important. And that's, where does the question come from? If you don't have a good question, it's hard to find, if you don't find a question to something really interesting and important, you're less likely to find an answer to it. I mean, you still may. After all, penicillin was discovered by accident. So one of the things that it turns out I seem to love doing, and I keep doing it, I don't know why, but I do, is I keep finding questions that it seems nobody else has asked. It often takes a long time for the question to crystallize. And then as it begins to crystallize, I begin to understand how I might investigate it. And it leads to hypotheses and then induction and deduction, all the rest of the stuff. So I seem to keep doing that, Perry. It may be that, and in fact, what I find myself doing is sampling the problem area, kind of like the Rorschachs, of looking at big things and then smaller things and littler things and back at big things, trying to kaleidoscope rotate it until some coherent thing begins to stumble into place. And it happens.
Could it be that you have a sadistic affection for questions when maybe most other people are annoyed by them?
Gosh, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, maybe. But maybe I can exemplify this by the first time I did it. So I was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford with my dear friend Stan Bates, surrounded by all of these Rhodes Scholars who basically, were smarter. And I had this amazing tutor. What was Stuart's last name? Anyway, I'll think of it in a sense. Anyway, he was a superb psychologist, and I just can't remember his last name right now. It's Stuart. Anyway, he would ask me all kinds of questions. And at that time, receptor fields were just becoming known in neurobiology, in which ganglions turn on and off. The eye ganglions turn on and off, and neurons turn one another on and off. And, I knew about that. I'd studied philosophy, so I knew logic and boolean logic. And a typical example that Stuart asked me was, take two parallel black lines on a white sheet. You can discriminate them. It's called vernier acuity, even though the distance between the two black lines is the distance between two cones or two rods, not three. So how the hell could it be possible to discriminate it? So that's an interesting kind of question I keep being stuck with. And I remember my answer. I thought, gosh, what if the eye is jiggling and you transform it into a temporal signal and you could discriminate black, white, black because your eye's wiggling? And I think that turned out to be correct. Anyway,
sounds right to me.
Yeah, and I think that's right. Anyway, I came back and I was on my way to medical school. I decided I didn't want to be a philosopher. My argument was, to be a philosopher, you have to be as smart as Immanuel Kant. I am not as smart as Immanuel Kant. Therefore, I will become a doctor. Perry, I couldn't even master the syllogism. So somehow I decided I was going to go to medical school. And what I thought was, I'm too fast and glib with my theories. I'll go to medical school and the bastards will make me learn a lot of facts and they'll be good for me. And in fact, it was. So on the way to medical school, I did a pre-medical year at Berkeley, and I took a course in embryology. And they had flatworms, and the experiment was to cut a flatworm in half, and the anterior half regenerated the posterior half, and vice versa. And I was just stunned. How the hell can that happen? Meanwhile, there was a problem that I can outline to you. You have about 300 different cell types: liver, kidney, nerve, so on. And it was known up to 1960 that all of the cells in your body have the same chromosomes, therefore have the same genes, but white cells make antibody molecules and red cells make hemoglobin. How come different genes are active in different cells? And nobody knew. So this was the problem of cell differentiation. And the breakthrough came in 1961 by Jacob and Monod, who got a Nobel Prize for showing that one gene can make a protein that binds next to another gene and turns it on or off. And in 1963, they published a seminal paper. Imagine you got two genes, Perry and Stu. I shut you off and you shut me off. We don't want to use turn on for the obvious reasons. So in that case, you can have two states, Perry on, Stu off, or Stu on, Perry off. And Jacob and Monod say, here, we've got it. We've got a little gene feedback circuit, and it's got two alternate patterns of behavior, two steady states. The same set of genes can give rise to different patterns of gene activity. That must be how cell differentiation works. So that's what I knew. And now I went and I did something really strange with it, because in a sense, I didn't know better. So, I mean, I knew how to think about genes turning one another on off, same as neurons turning one another on off, and I knew logic and Boolean logic. So what I thought was, so here was the funny step. Is there a class of networks whose behavior is sufficiently orderly that somehow that class of networks can just support the development of 300 or so cell types in an ontogeny normal development? What would such a class of networks be? It's the question that's surprising. I don't know where it came from, Perry. So let's say and most people would think it would be, well, it was estimated at the time that there's 100,000 genes. Evolution must have crafted some really amazing wiring diagram among 100,000 genes to get it to behave right. You know, how would you make a television set or a circuit on a computer? So that's sort of what everybody thought. I don't know why I didn't ask that question. I wanted to know if there's a class of systems. So that's a case of finding an interesting question. So what I did is, you know, how would you ask that question? Well, you need a class of systems. So you have to invent a class of systems. And I knew Boolean logic. So I said, imagine you've got n light bulbs, and each light bulb can be on or off like a neuron or a gene. And every light bulb has inputs from some of the light bulbs. Let's parameterize it by K. And every light bulb has some rules saying how it switches on or off depending upon what its inputs are doing. Well, it's a simple piece of math that if you've got K inputs, it turns out there's 2 raised to the 2 raised to the K power logical functions. I figured that out pretty fast, like and or and not. So I said, well, let's pick n and k and make random networks. So I have an ensemble where I've got, say, n 1,000, k2, and any old Boolean function assigned at random to every light bulb. So actually, it turned out I was inventing a new kind of statistical mechanics. But since I didn't know statistical mechanics, I didn't know I was inventing a new kind. The physicists invented the same thing about 8 years later. So I started making random Boolean networks. So just to give you the flavor for it, Perry, if the state of such a network is the current values of all the light bulbs, like they're all on or all off, and the network is in some state, at the next moment, each light bulb looks at its inputs and whether they're on or off, decides what to do to turn on or off. So all the light bulbs update synchronously in the simplest case. So the network goes from a state to a state to a state. There are n light bulbs, so 2 to the n states. So it goes through a set of states, and eventually it hits a state in before, then it cycles. It's called a state cycle or an attractor. And so what I found out was, and this is astonishing, I was 25, somebody taught me how to program Boolean nets. So I made a Boolean net model with 100 genes, each with 2 inputs. I didn't know how to randomize anything. So these were in the days where you had the deck of cards. So I walked up to hand in my deck my first time, and I shuffled the cards at the back half of the deck to randomize the connections. And the guys looked at me like I was out of my gourd. You know, what do you keep shuffling your program? And I put it in. So 100 light bulbs has 2 to the 100 states. Well, 2 to the 100 is about 10 to the 30, you know, which is a really big number. And I was paying for the computer time. I don't know why I didn't worry about it. I stuck the thing in, and about 10 minutes later, the computer output came back, and this network with 2 to the 100 or 10 to the 30 states had gone in and had found a little cycle that repeated through with 4 states on it. It had localized its behavior out of 2 to the 100th to 4. Isn't that astonishing?
Okay.
It astonished me, and still does. And I started at different initial states, and I found that it went into 3 different patterns, 2 length 4 and 1 length 2. So this thing is draining this enormous state space into a tiny number of these cycles, which are called attractors. It blew my mind then, and it still does. It's 50 years later, Barry. So I did a lot of work on it, and I published it in 1960. I went to work with Warren McCullough at MIT, and I published it in 69, 50 years ago. It's finally getting to be understood now. It's taken a long time. What I found is that the number of these patterns, these attractors, so the idea of these attractors are cell types, okay? There's a set of states that drain like rivers flowing into a lake. The lake is like the attractor. And from any attractor, you can get to another attractor by going over a rise and going down a river to the next lake. it turns out that the number of attractors scales is the square root of the number of light bulbs. This is a really weird result. So
Okay.
if you've got 10,000 light bulbs, 10,000 genes, you'd have about 100 attractors or 100 cell types. So it turns out we've got around 25 or 30,000 genes, which gets us pretty close to 300. Well, we just recently, Stefan Bornholt and I came back to my first paper with a lot of fiddling. The best evidence now across many phyla, if you plot log DNA on one axis, where DNA is a mark for the number of genes, on the x-axis is a log cell type on the y-axis. It's a power law, like square root, and the slope is 0.88, whereas the model actually predicts, with a little fiddling, 0.66. So I pulled out of something 50 years ago, something that is predicting a scaling relationship in the ensemble. I'll get to it a little bit more. That's actually predicting the number of cell types across, 20 phyla. Well, do we think that selection struggled to get a scaling law of a square root? That's just nuts. So I've argued then, and I argue now, this is a generic property of an ensemble of systems, which is the answer to my question from 50 years ago. And meanwhile, this raises the question, are genetic regulatory networks critical? So it turns out a bunch of work said these networks can be chaotic, they can be ordered, or they can be, in the wonderful phrase that Don Farmer came with, on the edge of chaos, which was a big phrase at SFI, at Santa Fe 20 years ago. Chris Langton pushed that, and I did. We now know, 50 years later, genetic networks are critical, and brains are critical, and there may be really good reasons for it, that we could go into. So this is an example of somehow, because I asked, is there a class of systems, and then discovered that there was a plausible class that did neat things, like giving these scaling laws, and the right number of model cell types. And now it looks like it's all correct. And it's weird in that it all started by asking a funny question.
So I can't imagine that any hospital or medical school was asking you to go figure this out.
Well, no, they weren't. In fact, along those lines, I was doing this when I was a medical student. And in pharmacology, they're showing, all of these molecules that do neat things. I mean, you're supposed to make drawings of organic molecules. And I was making little mathematical models of Boolean networks in my pharmacology notes. So I did really well at Dartmouth and really well at Oxford. I graduated sort of in the middle of my class in medical school, but I got the research prize my year. And I actually got a faculty position as an assistant professor when I was a junior in medical school, and I went to the University of Chicago. And later I got a MacArthur, probably mostly because of this work. And maybe the biologists will finally pay attention. Molecular biology is kind of molecular anatomy, and cell biologists and molecular biologists have a hard time thinking of the cell as a dynamical system. It's beginning to come in 50 years later, and the reason is you can now look at simultaneously the amount of RNA that each of 23,000 genes makes in a sort of a thing called a gene array. So now they can see the changing patterns of the light bulbs going up and down. And so people start saying, oh, it's real. So 50 years later, 40, 50 years later, these ideas are actually finally bearing fruit, I hope. So that's one example.
Well, okay. Well, that's very impressive. So, the question that when we were sitting in the seminar, and all of these different fields were being pulled together from all these different people, it's not something I've seen happen very often, and I thought, it's not easy to pull this off. So now, did this project, was it in any way assigned to you, or did you just was this a side project, or?
No, I just went and did it. In fact, I've always done that. I've had grants. I've had grants of $300,000 a year, basically from age 30 to age 54 when I took early retirement from Penn. I have grants now, but almost all of the important work that I've done, nobody would have paid for. So you just do it anyway.
So Okay, so let's talk about the grants. Were the grants for doing very, very specific things, or were they how wide or narrow were the parameters?
Well, I worked on fruit flies for a long time because I got an interesting idea that bears on what we're talking about right now, that fruit flies have these amazing mutants called homeotic mutants that switch an antenna to a leg and a head to a genitalia and a wing to an eye. Plants have them too. We do too in the lining of our gut and so on. And there's a small number of genes that control these transitions, these homeotic mutants. And I came up with the idea, published in 1971, I guess. Yeah, 1971 in Science, that that there's a binary, that there's some kind of epigenetic code, a sort of a combinatorial epigenetic code. So each tissue type, I thought, was controlled by not too many, 5 or 10 or so, master gene circuits, each controlling thousands of genes. And the master gene circuit, sort of like Jaco and Monod, can flip between Peri on Stu off and Stu on Peri off, okay? And so I published that model. And the big thing now is I think we can find the circuits. And I'm talking to, you met Sui Huang and Roberto Serra and Sarah Walker. So
Yes.
we're trying to form a little group to actually, I think it's now maybe possible to analyze gene expression data at the single cell level and figure out what the circuits are and try to learn to flip them from one state to another. If this combinatorial code idea is right, which it might be, and it might be hooey. And the dream would be that we could, in a modest number of years, flip any cell type, any other cell type, with implications for regenerative medicine and cancer. So it may pay off in a lot of ways, in the next 5 or 10 years. Maybe not.
Wow. Okay. Well, all right. So does that mean that you got a grant to do something and you did it, but you always found a way to smell the roses?
Yeah. Yeah. So I have typically done grant stuff and then stuff on the side. So if you want to hear this, I'll tell you a next case.
Mm-hmm.
So about age 30, that was 50 years ago, I'm just turning 80, I was wondering about the origin of life. I mean, why not? And the standard view at the time, and still the standard view, is DNA is a double helix that template replicates. RNA molecules can form a double helix, and you can imagine they template replicate. Therefore, the theory has been, since then, that life must be based on template replicating RNA-like molecules or polynucleotides. So I did something at the time that's sort of like what I did with random notes. Here's actually what I thought, Perry. What I thought was, well, what if the constants of nature were a little different and you couldn't make nitrogen in the universe and you couldn't make carbon, but you could make chemicals and you can make complex molecules and you'd have a bunch of reactions. Well, by that, thought experiment, you couldn't get DNA and RNA. And I thought, well, would life be impossible? I thought, that's just crazy. Life has to be a set of molecules that undergo a set of reactions. The reactions have to be sped up by catalysis, and you have to have a set of molecules that mutually catalyze one another's formation. So I came up with the idea of a collectively autocatalytic set. So to be explicit about it, I catalyzed the formation of you out of 2 Perry parts, and you catalyzed the formation of me out of 2 Stu parts. And it just seemed obvious, why not think that? And so in 71, I made a little model of it, and I found that you could get it. The basic idea turns out to be a phase transition, which is sort of easy to paint. This is the work of Erdos and Renier in 69 or 59. So put 1,000 buttons on the floor, take a spool of red thread, pick up a random pair of buttons and tie them together, put them on the floor, and just keep doing that. Every now and then pick up a button and see how many buttons you pick up. So this is their work. I just learned about it. So here's the x-axis. It's the ratio of threads over buttons. So take 1,000 buttons and you've got 10 threads, 100 threads, 500 threads, 1,000 threads, 10,000 threads. So you're tuning the ratio, you go up this way. And this size axis, plot the size of the biggest cluster you pick up, okay? It does something remarkable. It goes like that. It has a first order phase transition. What happens is that when the number of threads is half the number of buttons, since each thread has two ends, the number of ends of threads is equal to the number of buttons, and everything goes connected. Okay? So a bunch of theorems. Can you see it?
Well, I'm not, so I got 1,000 buttons on the floor. I'm going to start taking a thread.
You take off a piece of thread, pick up two buttons at random and tie them together.
Yeah.
Back on the floor. At random, pick up two buttons, tie them together, and just keep doing that.
Okay.
So the ratio of threads to buttons is going up. And the magical thing is, when the number of threads is about half the number of buttons, all of a sudden, a huge number of buttons are interconnected.
Because of the threads just crisscrossing on the floor.
Well, the threads aren't crisscrossing. I'm connected to you, you're connected to Bill, Joe's connected to Alan, and then finally Alan and Joe are connected to us.
Oh, hang on. So there can be more than one thread attaching to one button.
Correct.
Okay, I missed that part. Okay.
Yeah, so you get crosses. Okay. So it's a phase transition. So a slight abstraction, this is Erdos Marion 69. If you think of a chemical reaction network, you got a lot of substrates and a lot of products. Now imagine, and so just draw that with dots and boxes. Dots for the molecules and boxes for the reactions. Every box has arrows coming in from substrates and out to products. So you've got this big thing of dots and boxes. And now just throw catalysts in this thing. And if a reaction is catalyzed, color that reaction red, the arrows, okay? So you throw more catalysts in it, more and more arrows get red. All of a sudden, it all gets connected. It's the same phase transition, but the things that you're throwing at it are the molecules themselves that might be the catalysts. Okay?
Okay.
Buttons and threads. I might be able to catalyze a reaction that turns you into Billy. So Perry goes through the same phase transition, and this says that the emergence of molecular reproducing systems is a phase transition when the number of reactions is big enough and given some probability that anything catalyzes anything. You hear the question, right?
I think so.
Proven. And part of what has happened, Joanna gave a talk, I guess you heard, there is now a metabolic autocatalytic set that has been found in Archaea and bacteria from before oxygen. There's no polymers in this set. She talked about it. There's no polymers in this set. It makes amino acids and nucleotides. There's no DNA, there's no RNA, there's no proteins. Almost certainly life started with autocatalytic sets of small molecules.
So let me just rephrase what you said in maybe more lay language. So she's looking at the absolute oldest life forms on Earth, which are Archaea and certain kinds of bacteria. And she's saying, these don't have polymers.
No, hang on. They do have polymers, of course. And they're not the oldest, but they're more than 2 billion years old. If you just look at their metabolism, just strip out off the computer all the proteins, you just look at the metabolism. I can send you a picture of it. It's amazing. There's about 1,500 molecules and 1,500 or 1,600 reactions coupling them, and it's mutually autocatalytic. And some of the catalysts are
autocatalytic means a reaction that catalyzes itself.
Yeah, everybody in the set. So if I catalyze the formation of you out of Perry parts, and you catalyze the formation of me out of Stu parts, that's collectively autocatalytic. You might do it for yourself. So what she has found with Bill Martin, and it happens, Wim Hordick, Mike Steele, and I are on the paper. I had nothing to do with it. I'm just on the paper. She has found that there's an autocatalytic set in 2 very ancient organisms. They're different in the 2 organisms, but they share an intersection that's a smaller metabolic autocatalytic set that may go back pre-Luca, the last common ancestor, maybe to, a couple 100 million years after life started. This is really fundamental, Perry, because what it says is molecular reproduction did not start with template replicating RNA, almost certainly, and it did not start with self-replicating sets of peptides, which I've dreamt. I'm wrong. It started with metabolic autocatalytic sets. Then the thrill is.
Hang on, let me translate this to more English. So you're saying everybody thinks that you need DNA and RNA in order to have this replication.
Right.
And what this research is suggesting is no, you need the reactions that generate the metabolism of these
And the
primitive.
metabolism itself is autocatalytic. Okay? All
Okay.
the small molecules reproduce one another from some simple things that come in from the outside. Meanwhile, Gonan Ashkenazi was here and he talked. Gonan has a 9-peptide collectively autocatalytic set, and that absolutely proves that you do not need DNA and RNA to get molecular reproduction. You just don't. It doesn't mean you didn't have it. I think that Joanna's work with Bill Martin and me hanging on a little bit, and Vim and Mike probably did a lot on it, really strongly says molecular reproduction started without any polymers at all. None.
And you're talking about Joanna Xavier, who's in
right.
Germany, and she was at your meeting.
And she led that project. She and Bill Martin did. I think it's the most important result in the origin of life in a number of years. And I think it says that the RNA worldview of template replicating RNA being necessary for life is obviously false. And it's very unlikely that it was the way life started. It started the way Joanna is finding it now. And then Gabor Vate gave a talk, you may remember, on the clock of chemical evolution.
I remember that, but of course our listeners won't. So go ahead and tell us about that.
Actually, I'm on that paper too. Gabor did all the work. So here's what this is about. There's a big bang, and then we get hydrogen and helium, and then we get stars, and we get the synthesis of the atoms of carbon and hydrogen and sulfur and nitrogen. So the atoms of organic chemistry come into existence, and bigger atoms like lead and iron. Then, so think of the CHNOPS: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and phosphorus. Those are the atoms of organic molecules. Well, they start reacting with one another, making molecules, say with 1 carbon and 1 hydrogen, or 3 carbons and 4 hydrogens. Over time, these make more and more complex molecules. And what Gabor succeeded in doing is to say this chemical complexity explodes in diversity over billions of years. And there's now evidence that's absolutely certain. The Murchison meteorite formed in the solar system 5 billion years ago. It landed in Australia, and it's got about 35,000 organic molecules in it. At least that's at some level of detection. And I recently learned that we flew a spacecraft through one of the spumes coming out of Enceladus, a moon of Saturn, and it has 35,000 organic molecules. So the natural evolution of the lifeless universe makes more and more organic molecules, and they land on the early Earth after the Hadean. You got this rich soup of organic molecules, and now we have to ask, how hard is it to get what I'll call as a Joanna set, or a Joanna Bill set, or a Xavier Martin set? How hard is it to get an autocatalytic set of self-reproducing guys in a warm little pond or in a deep sea ocean? So now the task, since we know that the binary polymer model that I invented makes us a phase transition, we don't know how hard it is to get an autocatalytic set of small organic molecules. Life has it. So now we got to answer that. I hope that we will reason. Suppose you got that. Then the next steps towards life are get it into a dividing liposome in a pond. And then Roberto was talking about the fact that they'll synchronize their divisions. And then maybe we can get an autocatalytic set of peptides or whatever. And we're not far from protocell. So we all talked about that. So I think the origin of life story is moving well. There's lots of people working on it. I just think what Joanne and Bill have done is a turning point.
So when you were taking all these grants from age, I think you said 30 to 54, something like that?
Yeah.
So the stuff that they actually wanted you to do, did you find that interesting, or was that just a way to pay the bills?
No. I mean, you don't get grants that way. Well, I just fell in love with things. So a friend of mine named Art Winfrey studied coupled oscillators and did an amazing thesis. And he taught me about limit cycles and stuff. And I thought a limit cycle is for example, the Jabotinsky reaction, which you could do in a pot, oscillates. It just goes blue, then red, then blue, then red, then blue, then red if you stir it. And I thought, well, what's controlling the cell cycle? And I just stole Art Winfrey's idea. He was just an amazing guy. And I said, maybe the clock in the cell is a limit cycle oscillator. It's Art's idea, it's not mine. Well, so if you take a limit cycle and you perturb it, it'll return to the limit cycle, but maybe with a changed phase. So you can predict the phase changes. And there's a singularity inside the limit cycle that Art taught me about. That's, I need a piece of paper to show it to you. So I set out to work on an organism called Physarum polycephalum, which is really neat. It's an acellular slime mold, and it's called a plasmodium, and it can grow on a petri plate to be 6 or 8 inches across, and all the billions of nuclei in it synchronize, and they go through mitosis once every 12 hours within about 5 minutes. So there's some kind of clock. Then the cool thing is it just makes your pancake. You can cut a slice off of a Physarum due to go through mitosis at 12 o'clock, and another one due to go through mitosis at 4 o'clock, and you abut the two, and they glue together. And what do you think happens?
I don't know.
They go through mitosis at 2 o'clock. They phase average.
Oh.
So I just had a really neat time for several years saying, must be a limit cycle. What happens if you mix 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock and 2 o'clock and 7 o'clock and so, and I did all kinds of things that basically, so I did that for a number of years. Then I got this idea about Drosophila with this combinatorial epigenetic code and published it. And it makes the prediction that if you look at any one of these switches and project it onto the very early embryo or the egg, you can say the front house is going to be in the state 1 of this circuit, the back half is going to be in the state 0, or the two ends will be in the state 1 and the middle will be in the state 0. So it divides up the egg in certain ways. And some people have just found something called compartmental boundaries in wing disks, Garcia Bolito of that time. And this is really fun stuff. And so I went to work on Drosophila for several years. And I got funding for working on Drosophila. Then I actually did a hard experiment. The early stage of the egg is called the syncytial blastoderm, where there's no cells, there's just a lot of nuclei in the cytoplasm. So I got this microinjection thing and sucked nuclei and cytoplasm from the anterior of one egg, the donor, and stuck it in the posterior of a host and vice versa. Then went through gargantuan manipulations to find out if the anterior nuclei grew up to make anterior things like heads and antenna, and the posterior things make things like genitalia. And 2 years later, we succeeded, and it does. So I've actually done some hard experiments.
Okay, so just make sure I follow you. So what you found was the different organs of a fruit fly, whether it's the ones in the front or the back, are developed through chemical phase transitions.
Didn't say phase. What I found, Perry, in the simple language biologists use, is that the nuclei in the cytoplasm, a few hours after laying the egg, before it's even divided into cells, if you take the nuclei in the cytoplasm out of the front of the egg and you do the right things with it by transplanting in all sorts of ways, wind up making adult structures that come from the front of the fly. And if you take nuclei and cytoplasm from the back, they wind up making adult things that come from the back. So I basically showed that whatever you need to become committed is there already. And a lot of work's been done on Drosophila since then. But can I tell you another story?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so here I am with this theory about autocatalytic sets. The fundamental question is, so what's the probability that a randomly chosen random protein, random polypeptide, catalyzes some randomly chosen reaction? The whole theory depends on that, right?
It would seem low. Just as an engineer, that seems low.
Is low. And in 1982, I was at a conference, but I had the idea in mind. How would I ever test that? And in 82, I was at a conference and I was listening to a really fine geneticist, and he was talking about funny missing genes in bacteria and other genes taking over their function. It's called evolving beta-galactosidase. And I listened to him and I said, my God, I know how to test my idea. Make libraries of millions of random DNA sequences that code for millions of random of RNA sequences that make millions of different random proteins. Stick your random DNA sequence into a bacterium and see if it'll make a protein that catalyzes some funny reaction.
Okay.
I just said, oh, this is really hot. And it was. And I got a grant from Office of Naval Research for $900,000, and I guess 84. And I went to Geneva with Marc Balivet at the University of Geneva. And with Marc's guidance, these hands and my incapacity to titrate things, I actually made, with Marc's supervision, the very first libraries of random DNA, RNA, and protein on this planet. And we filed for patent in 85 that basically is the Balivet-Kauffman patent that says, make random DNA, RNA, and protein libraries with millions of things in them and clone them into, for example, viruses like Lambda GT11 and infect bacteria and see if you could find whatever you want. So I wanted enzyme activities, I wanted antibiotic activities. And about a year before, Perry, I was in Crete on a fruit fly conference, and I was walking around and thinking, wait a minute, think of estrogen, it binds an estrogen receptor. Think of the receptor as a lock and estrogen as the key. What if you made 1 million random peptides and asked, do any of you bind the lock? You must look like the key, right? So
Sure.
take the estrogen receptor and make millions of random peptides and see if anybody binds the estrogen receptor. They must look like estrogen. And then I got, you're on your way to a drug. And I was just blown away. So we wound up filing a patent for it. It issued in a whole bunch of countries. It became a huge industry. It's called Combinatorial Chemistry. I tried for around 10 years to make this pay off. I'm so dumb I didn't write a paper saying what the idea was. It wasn't dumb, Perry. I wanted to make it work myself. And I'm not a good enough molecular biologist to do it. And that was 85. And the patent was filed. In 1990, independently, George Smith invented phage display. You take viruses and you code random peptides on the outside of the virus. And what George, it just got a Nobel Prize for it last year, is you take 100 million phage different phage, and you put some molecular shape down on a Petri plate. It's a monoclonal antibody. And you put down the phage library, you wash off what comes off easily, then you change the buffer and you elute what's stuck. Then they're phage, so you amplify them and do it again. And about 4 or 5 times. George found that out of 20 million phage, about 20 stuck the monoclonal antibody. And that answers the question I had and that you just raised. The chance of binding of a random peptide, binding a random bump called an epitope, is about 1 in a million, which is just wonderful. The same year, Andy Ellington and Jack Shostak took a library of a few 100 million RNA and passed them over columns with molecular bumps attached to them. And they found things that bind. They were called RNA aptamers. I think the probability of binding is maybe 10 to the minus 10. I want to find that number. It's really important. And out of that grew what became combinatorial chemistry. And I failed experimentally, but we had the patent. If Mark had done it, we'd have succeeded in a year. He's a superb experimentalist. So all of that came out of my wondering how life could start, thinking of autocatalytic sets, which raises the question, what's the chance that a random polypeptide will do a reaction? Which led to, it's just the next question.
So if I were to give this a title, it would be Stu's Meandering History of Serendipities.
Yeah.
These are almost like, well, I just get curious.
No, it's not quite serendipity. Once you've thought collectively autocatalytic set of something like peptides, the next question is, so what's the probability that a random polypeptide will, catalyze a random reaction? That's not random. You're guided to it by the hypothesis asks the question. Then a few years later, I discovered there's a way to test it, make random libraries when cloning was coming in. Then I tried to do it and had the patent with Mark on it. And by the way, I had Drosophila grants at the time, and I literally went to the University of Pennsylvania and I said, I've just done this thing and it has nothing to do with what I'm funded for. Can I please take it out from the university? And we negotiated, and they said, yeah, pay us 5% a year. And so they made a fair amount of money, and I made some money. And that's what happened. But the real work was done by, Jack Shostak and Andy Ellington, and lots of people. Francis Arnold just got the Nobel Prize in chemistry for this work. We were all kind of friends back then and working on this. It's really nice stuff.
So, which ended up producing more lasting value? The projects you were officially working on, or the projects that were totally on the side?
The latter. Without a doubt.
Okay, so when early on, okay, when you were 32, let's say, were you chafing at, well, I got to do this. I got this thing in front of me and I got to do it, but I really want to go do this. Or were you enjoying what you were doing?
Well, when I was 32, I was at NIH, National Cancer Institute, and I was just learning how to do Drosophila experiments, and I really wanted to do them. I'd given up Physarum, and I was doing, and I had sort of finished my work with random Boolean nets, and I'd published my stuff on the origin of life, and a very famous chemist, theoretical chemist, came in to my office one day at the university. He said, "You did what?" I said, "I just did this thing, sir." And he said, "Why are you doing anything as stupid as that?" So I stopped doing it. Then in 1982 or 83, I guess, I was at a conference in India, and Freeman Dyson's book had just come out on the origins of life. We did it independently of one another, and Phil Anderson, Nobel laureate, had come out with another book on the origin of life. And they were brilliant guys. And I don't know where I got the arrogance, but I read it and said, I was doing better at that in 1971. I'm going to go back and work on it again. So on a flight back from Bhopal, I actually proved some theorems in the airplane, which is strange for me, showing that you get this phase transition to autoclinic sets. And then I worked on it with some friends, Don Farmer and Norm Packard up at Los Alamos. And we showed that on a computer it works. And so, I did that for a while. And that was around when I was, coming up with the patent.
Was along the way, was there a phase transition where you started mostly just doing what you wanted to do?
I kind of always have.
Did the have to stuff ever just go away?
Well, it was never have to, Perry. It wasn't a burden to try to find out if the cell cycle in Physarum is a limit cycle. That's a really neat project. And, I loved it for several years. And it was a serious passion to understand how fruit flies develop. And I did that for 10 years. But I was doing this other stuff on the side. So I've never gotten grants for stuff that I didn't think was neat and fun and important. What happened about my age, 42 or 43, I thought, I really haven't had a new idea about fruit flies. I'm going to go back and just do some theory for a while. So I did a bunch of theory. Then I came to the Santa Fe Institute and I invented some other stuff. And basically I borrowed the idea of spin glasses from the physicists, and I made models of complex combinatorial optimization problems for a number of years, back in the 80s and 90s. And then I did the most important thing that I did in my life. I've written a book called Investigations. And what happened is I was trying to figure out what's an autonomous agent. So here again, where did this question come from, Perry? I was trying to figure out autonomous agents do things on their own behalf. That bring up glucose gradients. And I started, to get food. And I wondered, what does a physical system have to be an autonomous agent? You couldn't possibly get a grant for that. So I started thinking about
let me just pause. It's because this is such a deep philosophical question. It's essentially the question of free will that people have been arguing about forever. And you're saying, if you wrote a grant and said, well, I'm going to figure this out, people would think you're stupid.
Yeah, it would never get funded. So I just started keeping a notebook on my computer in December '94, and I had read Wittgenstein when I was at Oxford. So I started this thing off. I said, I put on a British accent. I said, investigations, mimicking philosophical investigations. Then I said, confidential, lots of bullshit below. And I just kept taking notes and writing what I was thinking about for about 8 months, from 1 to 3 or 4 hours a day, and all kinds of weird things that I didn't know how to articulate them.
Mm.
Flowed together, and it became investigations. And it was for me a big transformation in my life. So it became investigations, and I started realizing all kinds of real weird things. So I wound up with something like a definition of an autonomous molecular agent, is that it can reproduce itself and do one or more thermodynamic work cycles, and can make a choice. So I was publishing that, whenever it was, I guess in the 90s. Then I published Investigations in 2000, and I started realizing strange things, like the biosphere is doing something that's not computational, it's not algorithmic. That led a number of years later to what may be the most important thing I've ever done, and I was doing it, and a wonderful man named Giuseppe Longo and his student Mael Monteville were doing. We all met in 2010, and I gave a talk saying in evolution, the biosphere keeps changing its phase space in ways that we can't say ahead of time. I'll translate that in a minute. And independently, Giuseppe got up, he's a mathematician, he says, in evolution, the biosphere is changing its phase space in ways that we can't pre-state. And we looked at one another and said, we must be saying something the same.
Mm-hmm.
We got together in Burlington. I was at UVM at the time, University of Vermont. And we spent 10 or 15 days. And out of it came a paper that I may be most proud of. It's called No Entailing Laws, but Enablement in the Evolution of the Biosphere. So basically what we believe we've shown is, this is really big. And if you ask me what's practical about it, I don't know. But let me frame it in the following way. You have Newton, and you have Newton's laws, and Einstein, and it's deterministic classical physics, leaving out statistical mechanics for the moment.
And what you mean by that is that if you set up the conditions a certain way, there is only one way they will run, and it
Right.
will just
Yeah.
like robotically have an outcome.
So it's the 8 balls rolling on the billiard table, and Newton told us how to think 350 years ago. He says, look, find the forces among the balls. So in Newton's case, it's the first, second, and third law. Write down differential equations representing those forces. Put in the boundary conditions, the edges of the table, and the initial condition, the positions and the momentum of the balls. Please integrate my equations, and you'll get the trajectories of the balls for all time, leaving out friction. Well, to integrate the differential equations is to deduce the consequences of the differential equations for the motions. It's the same as all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal. So Newton gives us a way of thinking of the world in which there's laws, and there's an entailing procedure called integration, and we've been thinking that way since Newton. Mm-hmm. So then quantum mechanics comes along, and Einstein is really bitter about having to give up determinism, and there's this big crisis in physics about giving up determinism for 20 years. But it's in the same conceptual framework, Perry. The Schrodinger equation is a linear wave equation, and what propagates deterministically is a probability distribution. That's deterministic, and then measurement is this weird thing that happens, say on von Neumann, where whap, something happens, like it's the measurement effect. So, but there's still the same conceptual framework. You've got laws, you've got boundary conditions, you've got initial conditions, and you integrate. Just what Newton told us.
Billiard balls.
Yeah, they're billiard balls. Here it's a probability distribution. Around 1977, Phil Anderson wrote a paper saying more is different. I mean, Phil's just wonderful. He's my hero. He's in his 90s now. Amazingly intuitive man. And basically what Phil says is that new laws emerge at higher levels that may not be reducible at all to some fundamental level. The Navier-Stokes equation is a case, but all sorts of cases. So he opened the question whether reductionism is the total answer. And Robert Laughlin did too in a book called The Universe from the Bottom Down. What they're saying is new laws emerge at a higher level can you or can you not reduce them to a fundamental level? Meanwhile, there's Steven Weinberg saying there's fundamental laws down there that will entail everything. So there's this debate in physics. What I'm saying with Giuseppe and Mael, it's the three of us, is much more radical. There's not even any laws for the evolution of the biosphere, let alone laws you can reduce to fundamental physics. So the summary statement is the worldview of physics ends at the watershed of evolving life. And it really does, Barry. There's no law, period.
Well, you know, Stu, for me personally, I don't know if I would go so far as to say there's no law, but I absolutely agree that physics alone doesn't explain life. My evolution $10 million prize is a search for information. And I don't think information is a material thing. It is a pattern. It's kind of like saying, is the number 7 real? It was like, well, you can't weigh it and you can't measure it, and and it doesn't have any energy, but people are talking about it all the time, right? And so abstract immaterial things do exist, and I'm not seeing exactly the same thing you are, but they're related. It's like there are these different levels of reality, and you're saying even just looking at the way systems interact with each other, you can't
living systems.
Yeah, living systems.
Yeah.
Right. That there's a whole different category.
Yeah,
and this is the mystery.
What?
This is the big mystery right here.
It is the big mystery. What's happened? So my last book has the title, I think, that I mentioned to you. It is A World Beyond Physics, The Emergence and Evolution of Life. And exactly what I mean by the title World Beyond Physics is physics still applies to order. I mean, you'll fall like a rock will, but there's no law that entails the evolution of the biosphere, the way Newton's laws entail how rocks fall.
Right. Evolving life is not billiard balls.
No. And it's really sweet because superb physicists, I won't name any names. I have some fun with a colleague of mine. I was at a 75th birthday party not too long ago. And he did the perfect physics thing. He said, these biologists, if they'd have been with Galileo on the Tower of Pisa, they'd have dropped off red rocks and blue rocks and green rocks and see if they fell at a different speed. And all the physicists sort of chuckled knowingly.
Yeah.
The biologists are kind of stamp collectors. But of course, the question isn't, you'll fall at the same speed a rock will. The question is, how come there's a parity in the universe? Most complex things will never exist. The universe is non-ergodic above the level of atoms, or if Vatte's right, it's 500 Dalton. The question is, how ever did the human heart come to exist in the universe? Most complex things will never exist.
Because what you're saying, to put it in different words, is life does not search all of the random combinations in order to find a heart. It constructs a heart of some kind of pattern of its.
Something that was a pre-heart. Okay. I mean, the universe will not make all possible complex things. And I've been realizing this for a long time. So just, proteins are made of 20 kinds of amino acids. So a protein with 200 amino acids has 20 times 20 times 20, 20 to the 200th possible proteins length, 200. That 20 to the 200th is 10 to the 260th, which is a gargantuan number. The number of particles in the universe is 10 to the 80th. So as they say in physics, a back of the envelope calculation says, if all the particles were doing nothing on the Planck timescale, but making proteins length 200, it would take 10 to the 35th times the age of the universe to make them all. And that means the universe will never make most complex things. There's an infinite sink upward in complexity that the universe is exploring at the level of organic molecules, and life is exploring it. And there's no stopping it and go all the way. Somehow I think that there's some anti-anthropic thing going on in which life builds itself up into ever-increasing complexity from the origin of life to redwood trees. We only dimly understand it. But I'm doing something else in front of you, Perry. This is finding interesting questions. You can't get a grant for this. You couldn't possibly. Yet, my feeling is it's fundamental. I mean, we really think there's no laws. If we're right, this is a bigger crisis for physics than quantum mechanics. And it means we have to figure out how to, and it's beyond the Newtonian framework. It's the Newtonian, you can't do Newton. Period.
So this is wonderful. And I'm going to take this to close this off and finish.
Yeah.
Because where you're headed with this dovetails into a conversation we had yesterday. And so part of your journey has led you to starting to investigate psychic phenomena and things of that nature, which there's years and years of literature on, and that you've had personal experiences with. And I said, Stu, that's awfully bold of me. And I loved your answer. You said, well, why not? I'm 80 years old and I don't have a job. What are they going to do to me?
Right.
And that was like a thrilling thing to hear, because there's not nearly enough people who are willing to go ask dangerous, controversial questions. Like, I hope people were listening 2 minutes ago, because what you said was physics is about to hit a huge crisis of realizing that there's a whole class of things that it's never going to explain with its existing.
Yeah, whether they'll find it a crisis or not, I don't know. I think I am really quite certain that we're right. I mean, somebody may show that we're wrong. I think this is beyond Gödel's theorem, by the way.
Ooh, okay.
Well, Gödel has axioms, and he says, given a set of axioms, you can show there's a statement that says about itself, given the axioms, you can't derive me, which is, magnificent. There's no axioms for the becoming of the biosphere. None. Yeah, so, well, I mean, my father did reasonably well, and I haven't lost his money, so I have an adequate income, and nobody's going to hire me at 80, and I'm free to do whatever I want.
Well, God bless independent thought. Well, Stu, this has been great. I definitely want to endorse your book, Beyond Physics, which you just talked about, which people can get on Amazon. And I want to thank you for indulging me today. This has been fantastic.
Well, it's fun, Perry. So thank you. Okay, it's fun for me. I do have a comment to make. Science takes all kinds of people. It takes, there's the hedgehogs and the foxes. I was talking about my colleague Hans Frauenfelder, who spent his entire life working on the folding of myoglobin, and that's a perfectly good hedgehog, and he's done superb work on it, and spin glass models and protein quakes and stuff. And von Neumann's a fox, and I'm obviously more a fox than a hedgehog for whatever reason. And the reason it happens to me is I just keep getting curious about things. But we need everybody. We need people who are doing that. We need people who are doing what I'm doing. We're taking people who take and work it out carefully and dig into what it's got. It's this collective thing. Too many of me is useless.
Absolutely. Well, this has been great. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry.
Until next time, this is the Evolution 2.0 podcast, bridging science, technology, business, and the big questions. To ensure you never miss an episode, subscribe on iTunes or on your preferred player. If you like the show, rate us on iTunes. Join our email list and social media at cosmicfingerprints.com.